Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion, which you might be able to see behind me, it's tropical houseplants. Are you just getting into the hobby and realizing that maybe some of the things that you need to get to keep your plants happy might be a bit expensive? Or have you been in the hobby for a while and are maybe looking for a different option when it comes to purchasing some of your staples but not spending an arm and a leg? In this video, I'm going to go through what I think is one of the better kept secrets in the world of houseplant collecting, growing, and caring for plants. And that is utilizing different channels of purchase than you might think. So what I mean by that is most people, when they're looking for a new plant or they're looking for some substrate, and by substrate I mean things that you will grow your plants in, they will go to a plant store, they might go to a garden center, they might find some of this in their local supermarket, things like that. The one place that a lot of people might not necessarily think to look for things is pet shops. And for some of you that have known this for a while, you probably either have fish tanks or you've got reptiles. But I don't have fish, but I do have reptiles, so I know I am nodding the same way that you are nodding. But let's share this information with everybody and let's hope, oh, I might get a lot of hate from the pet community now. Let's hope that some of these items don't go out of stock in the pet shops that we're buying our materials from. Apologies if it does. But let me give you a bit more kind of concrete examples of some of the things that you can get in some of these pet shops. And I use this term pet shops as kind of an umbrella term. Some of these might be specialist reptile shops. Some of these might actually be your run-of-the-mill pet shops. So I'll give you an example. Substrates. Let's go for the easiest one out of all of it. Coco Coir, which is a substrate that a lot of people will use. I use that a lot for my aroid soil mix. And it can be quite expensive for places like Amazon and going to plant stores and garden centers and all these things. And I mean, again, it's not a hugely expensive material. However, Coco Coir is also a substrate that a lot of people, and I'm not touching on whether or not these things are necessarily good for pets, but some of these, so it's a substrate that is available and can be used as kind of bedding material, essentially. I'm trying to think of a better way to use for it, for a lot of reptiles. So reptile stores will carry it, and a lot of the times, and this is going to be a sweeping generalization for this video, that most of the time in these types of pet shops, these materials will be cheaper than you would find them, say, at a plant store or a garden center, because that's not the intended audience. And you need to also remember that if something like Coco Coir is being used in a reptile enclosure, at some point, quite frequently, probably more frequently than you would be changing soil in your plant pots, that needs to get refreshed because reptiles have excretions. So at some point that needs refreshing. So it needs to be affordable. Now, I was talking with a very, very dear subscriber, viewer on here who was saying the same thing. We had this discussion. And the interesting thing with that, and they were making the comment that the price can be a bit cheaper, but also, and I mentioned that there might be issues maybe with Coco Coir being rinsed in salt water, so there might be some salted deposits within the soil, but reptiles can be quite sensitive to things like that within their substrates. So I would imagine, I'm not saying that I know this 100%, that's potentially, and this is the conversation we were having, these substrates probably don't actually have as many of these particulates in them because it might be quite harmful to a very sensitive animal like a reptile might be. So that is a really interesting thing. So not only is the substrate going to be potentially cheaper, but it might be of slightly better quality for what you need it to be, if that makes sense. So that's one thing. The other thing that you get in abundance, again, because this is used as bedding material for a lot of reptiles, this one might not be as good quality as you might get from a plant store, is things like sphagnum moss. So sphagnum moss, again, is used a lot of the times within kind of terrariums, and I'll come back to terrariums in a minute, for a lot of reptiles. So you can get it relatively cheaply. And if anybody's bought really cheap sphagnum moss from places like Amazon, a lot of the times you'll see that it either has reptiles or amphibians on it and things like that. The thing that you'll quickly realize is, yes, it can be cheaper than the long fiber sphagnum moss, but it's because it's chopped up really finely. It might have other particulates in it. It might have quite a lot of other particulate, like little twigs and sticks and kind of pine needles and things like that, which you might not want to add into your soil mix, because potentially all of these things, and I remember watching videos years ago on this now, that some of those cheaper mixers, because they've got some of those materials in that do start to decompose within soil, if you're going to add that sphagnum moss into soil, or even if you're propagating in a very kind of humid environment like a propagation box, it could kind of alter the pH of the substrate. So possibly not the best thing. If you're on a budget though, and you don't mind sitting there and picking out all these little sticks and pine needles, I did when I was doing this because I was on a budget when I was first trying it out. It's a great option, and it's something that's readily available and generally quite cheap from pet suppliers like this. Another form of substrate, and this is more leaning towards the aquatic side of things, is something called Stratum, if I'm not mistaken, and I think the company is called Flavum or Fluval. I think it's Fluval. And it kind of looks like very, very small pieces of lava rock. And I quickly did a bit of online kind of snooping to see what it might be. I think it does say that it's kind of linked to kind of volcanoes, so it might just be volcanic rock, which is already a particle that's within things like pond, and a lot of people are using it in a semi-hydro situation. Obviously, it's meant more as kind of substrate for aquariums, but they are using it, and they've had good success, and I've had a lot of people that keep asking me this. No, I haven't tried it yet. Will I be trying it? Yes, just because I want to see what it's like. Interestingly, the thing that was holding me back was the fact that it was quite expensive. Even more interesting, and that was when this started becoming a thing a couple of months ago, when I was looking at a bit more information in the last couple of days, that price is considerably lower now. So I might be purchasing it sooner rather than later, basically, because that was holding me back, because I'm just like, similar to pond, I've already got pond. I could just buy kind of small lava rock particles the way that people do when they're making their own kind of semi-hydro pond DIY mixers. Is it the same thing? That might be an experiment that I run, actually. That might be, I'll buy this Flavum thing, the Stratum thing, Fluval, Stratum, words, and maybe benchmark it against buying something like just straight up lava rock and see about growing in both of those. Maybe try it with something simple like a pothos, because everybody's experimental plant is a pothos, because it will always be a pothos, and see how it goes and see if there's any real difference. Because I would hazard a guess something that's not branded or has got a kind of product name behind it, if it's the same thing, the non-branded thing, the more generic, would be cheaper. But the point still stands. This is something that you would find in a pet shop, not in, well, at least not at the time of filming, because I have seen some of these things happen that have moved over from pet shops into plant shops. But at the moment, this is something that you would find in a pet shop, not a plant shop. The other big one, and this we're starting to talk about more tech situations now, is things like humidity meters, thermometers that might be used in kind of reptile tanks. Again, because depending on the type of reptile that you have, and I'll give you the two examples that I've got. So I've got a crested gecko, which needs higher levels of humidity, and then I've also got a bearded dragon, and the bearded dragon needs very low levels of humidity. The bearded dragon also wants higher temperatures. The crested gecko doesn't need as high temperatures. So you can see that people that have these types of reptiles have got similar need to be able to tell quickly what the temperature is, what the humidity is. And I know they've kind of, and this is interesting because with a lot of reptiles, they might go towards a heat gun, like that's laser thermometer readers thing. I don't know how else to describe it. It's, yeah, you point it, it's got a laser, it tells you, it's an instant read thermometer essentially, because the ones that you would put in the tanks aren't as accurate. However, the ones that you put in the tank, because they're not as accurate, have come down in price when it comes to the pet world, at least from what I can see. Sometimes it can be cheaper than what you can find to buy online. Because for us, the kind of thermometer readers and the humidity readers are a must, and we must have it. So if you're buying it from somebody that's selling it for plants, they can raise up the price. Whilst with pet stores, if it's considered a second quality product, because there's something better, it will be cheaper by default. So that's another one that's quite interesting that you could potentially use. On the same kind of thinking as tech, and I did do a video about heat mats and my experiences with them, and I bought Seedling Heat Mats. See where I'm going with this? There are also Reptile Heat Mats, which pretty much do exactly the same thing as a Seedling Heat Mat. Now, I will say the Reptile ones probably won't be cheaper than the Seedling Heat Mats that are meant for seedlings. However, based on my experience with the seedling one, and as I said, it's probably really good if you're just growing vegetable seeds or regular seedlings to kind of get them going, but you lack that control. Now, the interesting thing is for Reptile Heat Mats, they come with thermostats and temperature probes. So let me give you a very specific example. And I did say this in my video about heat mats, that I tried putting a heat mat underneath a propagation box, and I was even having the lid slightly cracked. It turned everything into soup because it couldn't control that temperature. Imagine if you had a similar heat mat underneath a propagation box with the lid slightly open as well, so it doesn't kind of steam whatever cutting you're trying to propagate in it. So just crack this tiny bit and you can close it on occasion basically. And then you can have a thermometer probe within that propagation box, and you can set it to a temperature that you think the plants will appreciate and like. And what that will do is it will kind of, pretty much what it generally will do is switch on and off the heat mat in order to maintain that temperature. So obviously if it drops beneath the set temperature that you want it to be, it will kind of switch it back on. If it reaches it or seems like it's going to go over it, it will switch it off. Very simple technology, however, very, very powerful. Now, and this is the interesting thing as well, it probably will be more expensive in this situation than getting the seedling heat mat. And I'll give you an example of kind of possibly some false economy. I got 2 seedling mats without this thermometer, and they're meant to be for seedlings, they weren't for reptiles. Probably in total price, it was the same as one of the reptile ones with the thermometer probe and the thermostat. Looking back on it now, I was a false economy. I got 2 things that don't work particularly well, and for cheaper, I could have had one thing that does it perfectly, basically. So do let me know if you've had experiences with using the Reptile heat mats with the thermostat and the thermometer probe. I would imagine that it kind of works really, really well. Coming on to the topic of terrariums, and I mentioned this a bit ago, basically, and some of you that have been here for a while will know that I have the BioOrb air terrarium, and don't get me wrong, it is a beautiful thing. It kind of looks like an art piece. Now, there's several things that I'm going to say about this, and they've probably already been said by a lot of other people. Yes, there's issues because there's matting, and the plants will root into the matting, and it's very difficult if you ever want to pull it out without ripping all the roots to shreds. That's one issue. The price is really expensive. I've had mine working quite well for about 3 years now, And it's getting to the point now where I need to open up the lid and do some maintenance in it, that when I switch off the lid, the lights don't switch off automatically. There's not an awful lot of manual manipulation that you can do with that one. And I was kind of looking at it going, okay, do I need to change a part? No. For a very expensive piece of machinery, the only thing, and this is very difficult to find, is I would need to replace the lid, the entire lid that has all of these mechanisms in it, which costs almost as much as just buying a new one. And when it costs as much as it did, that kind of rubs me a bit raw. But I will say, benchmarking it against that, terrariums or vivariums, all of these things that were meant for reptiles a lot of the times, unlike something that is purpose-built for plants, tend to be cheaper. Obviously, they will get more expensive the larger you go for, but they have a lot of inbuilt technology within them. Obviously, you can go for something really cheap. I think it's cheap anyway. I never bought it myself, but the IKEA kind of glass cabinet, the IKEA terrarium that's been dubbed by I think most people at this point. And that's obviously quite large, but you then need to put fans in it. So you need to kind of make sure that there's ventilation going in, not just the air movement around, all of these things. With a lot of these reptile terrariums, there's ventilation built in, so they might already have fans that are built in. It's already fully watertight, potentially, especially if you're buying something like a vivarium, so you can put a layer of water at the bottom. You can do all of these things. You don't need to use the matting. Yes, this is probably a bit more for the kind of advanced users out there, but there's some interesting ones that will also have internal kind of spray nozzles, and they will kind of mist water the same way that my BioOrb would do, although that never does it because it's always at a very high humidity level. But yeah, so that is one of those things that exists there. And a lot of the times, not always, there's always going to be a caveat with this video, not always, but a lot of the times it can be cheaper than something that's purpose-built for plants. And it will do exactly the same thing, possibly even better actually. The other big one is, and again, this is linking to aquariums again, is something that I think I hear people calling a bubbler. And it seems like a device that you would put into an aquarium and it bubbles oxygen, it kind of releases oxygen within that water. Now, a lot of people that I know have had great experiences using things like a bubbler in water vessels that they are water propagating in, because again, it's injecting that oxygen within it, but it was never made for plants. It was made for aquariums. I'm sure it helps with the kind of keeping, I'm assuming, I've never really owned an aquarium, so I'm probably gonna talk rubbish now. I'm going to be corrected by a lot of people that have got aquariums. I'm assuming it does something to the pH of the water. It probably helps a bit with the aquatic plants as well. It probably helps with oxygenating the water, I guess. It probably does what it says on the tin. But I know that at least from what I've seen from people with plant propagations, especially water propagations, they've had good success with this. And I think this isn't quite the same thing, but it's in the same kind of line of thought with, and I'm trying to think, and I'll find it and put it up here as well. There's certain propagators that some of the more commercial growers might be buying, and you can buy, there's kind of home versions as well, where there's a plug, there's a cutting within something that holds the cutting. The node is exposed at the bottom, there's a water reservoir at the bottom, and it constantly sprays water and air around. There's air and there's constantly spraying water around that node, and those can grow roots super quickly. It's a similar kind of mentality of that kind of like water and oxygen being readily available as well. So really, really quite cool, but again, not something that was ever really meant exclusively for plants. And just as a little bonus tip here as well, if you're thinking about getting something like an aquarium separate from your plants, I'm not saying get an aquarium because you've got plants. If you wanted it separately, there's also a lot of value to that there, because I cannot count the amount of times that I've had people, viewers of my videos or subscribers or followers on Instagram going, oh yeah, I've also got an aquarium. So whenever I'm changing out the water, I use that water to water my plants, and they love it. Because guess what? Fish poo is quite good potentially within the soil. I would imagine it's kind of a similar situation to worm castings, which is worm poo. So that's kind of cool to have. As I said, please don't, because they're a big commitment and you kind of need to know that you want to do this. But if you're thinking about doing it and you just happen to have plants, it might not be something necessarily you thought of, but yeah, reusing some of that water would be really, really cool. And coming on to the topic of caretakers, I was talking about terrariums just a moment ago, but things like springtails, isopods, and these are things that you would normally put into a terrarium for your plants because they will essentially eat away at the rotting materials, so you don't really need to do too much. They do most of the heavy lifting for you. They're also used not only as caretakers within reptile vivariums or aquariums, or vivariums or terrariums, but they're also used as feed a lot of the times for certain reptiles or amphibians. So if you're buying something as feed instead of something that is going to maybe look pretty or do what it needs to do in a terrarium that's meant for a plant, so they can kind of hike up the prices sometimes when it's looking at plants, getting it from a reptile specialist when they're using this as feed, if you're not buying these bugs for something to look pretty, so I know a lot of isopods, I think there's one that's called a cow something, and it's white and it's got black dots, and it's pretty to look at, and some people have them as pets as well on their own, but not those. Those are something different, basically. It might be something a bit more interesting to look at, and you might want that in your plant terrarium because it creates a bit of interest, especially if you're not going to have anything like reptiles or amphibians in there. But yeah, like a standard isopod that's just going to be there to do a job, get the feeder ones. They're great. They'll still do the job, and they'll thank you for not end up being some reptile's food. There is that as well. But yeah, things like that a lot of the times tend to be quite cheap from reptile stores or pet stores. The other thing as well that you can get sometimes with this is kind of, I'm forgetting them, like kind of colonies essentially. So you might not get a huge box of these things to put straight into a terrarium, but it's because what a lot of people will do with reptiles a lot of the times is you don't constantly want to be buying these feeder insects. They kind of breed the feeder insects so they can have more to then give to their pet. So you can get stuff like that as well. So you can, if you're getting in breeding because you're going to be doing a lot of terrariums, or you want to have it in all of your plant pots because, I'm not going to lie, I've had done previous videos where I talk about the benefits that I experience with isopods not isopods, springtails. Springtails are easier to kind of keep within a pot. Isopods will probably kind of scurry away as much. They're better for terrariums, but isopods will stay within that pot of soil. I did get some hate with that one, saying that it also could cause issues with the plants. 5, nearly 6 years later, and everything that had isopods in it is possibly some of my biggest, most established and happiest plants ever. I've not personally had a problem. I'm not saying that it won't happen, but in my experience, it hasn't been too bad as long as you don't overdo it, obviously. But yeah, so things like that are always really, really cool. So you can get these colonies and you can kind of create more. So you don't have to just buy and use. You can buy, breed, and use over and over and over again. And I'll finish off with something that, again, might surprise some of you. You can get plants, houseplants, tropical plants, from reptile stores, pet stores as well sometimes. I'm not going to lie, it's not going to be the rarest plant in the world. You're probably going to be looking at pothoses and possibly Monstera deliciosas and all these things. And they will tend to be baby-sized plants, not generally full-size plants. But a lot of the time, they are considerably cheaper than you would be getting the same kind of common baby plants from a plant store or a nursery or a garden center, because they're meant as live decoration in terrariums. So top tip there as well. Scour some of these reptile stores or pet stores for actual living plants, because you can get baby plants at a stupidly low price sometimes. So yeah, I think that's my big takeaway for this one. As I said, possibly one of the better kept secrets if you want to keep budgets down and you want to experiment with a few things, but you don't want to kind of break the bank. Look elsewhere other than just the standard plant stores or garden centres or plant nurseries, look at something like a pet shop. But yes, I think I've prattled on for far too long. I am sure a lot of you will be telling me your experiences down below, and I look forward to reading that and having that conversation with you as always. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.